Hi, my name is Peter Carey and welcome to my submission of GAM451.1 Virtual Economies game pitch. Today I will be presenting a game with the working title Eternal Sins, named as such to fit into an existing set of my games referred to as the Eternal series. The game itself is of the fantasy survival genre and focuses on a series of network elements tied to a central server and between players. Server communication includes elements such as authorization and player communication. Players may also invite friends into a game session, allowing for direct multiplayer. The player experience and progression in Eternal Sins revolves around the use of player trade mechanics, such as the mail and auction house systems. Eternal Sins is currently a first-person game, with an incredibly simple player avatar. This is to facilitate the post-production work of a conversion to a VR interface. Due to the first-person viewpoint, the player will not be able to see their avatar directly. Instead, they will view it in reflective surfaces such as mirrors and water. At a low milestone, the player will gain access to a simple mirror recipe, which will not only allow them to view their avatar from their home, but allow them to modify their own avatar shading and customization. During direct networked multiplayer, players will obviously view each other's avatars. This will allow for players to preen and show off their customizations. In order to maintain scope, for the initial release of the game, players will be limited to color and texture variations of body parts. The game will use a toon shading technique. The simplification of light calculations in this will allow the game to function well on a variety of machines, and is subjectively quite pleasing. The terrain will be cubic. This significantly decreases the scope of work required for creating the generation of terrain and navigation systems. It will also decrease the size of terrain saves by a fair amount, which is essential as in order to create a fair play space, worlds will need to be stored as encrypted online files. In order to help free the player from monotony, biomes will be diverse, with wide ranges of color and texture. For example, forests will have plenty of fine texture detail, such as bark and leaves coating the ground. The color palette will consist of deep greens and browns, highlighted by lighter greens and yellow of young leaves and flowers. However, the glacial biome will consist of whites, greys, and blacks, with very little fine detail, instead opting for calm swaths of shading, allowing the player's eye to confuse direction and terrain shapes. Players may apply skins to items that they own, altering its appearance for the duration of its lifetime. An item may have multiple skins which may be applied to it. An item such as the wooden spear will have skins such as the classic skin, a Roman skin, or a brutal skin. The variation of item appearance will allow for further customization from the player and leads to further individualization. The core game loop of Eternal Sins is evocative of many games in the survival crafting genre, such as Ark Survival Evolved or Conan Exiles. The player must gather resources and use these to craft tools and components, and use these tools and components to build a house and base fortifications. These buildings allow for an expansion of mechanics, such as item storage and further crafting facilities, and player protection. As the player establishes a higher level of presence through their buildings, they will be able to gather common resources faster and begin to collect high-level resources, allowing for a recurring loop of resource and building quality. As even a low-level building may provide a significant amount of player protection, the environment is split into biomes. These biomes host different types of resources, and the player will need to collect each of these types to make any significant progress within the game. Thus, they will have to leave the safety of their base and travel to the resource, introducing a level of risk and reward. The nature of procedural generation is even with this strict control, a player may experience unfair circumstances, such as resource drought or an unreasonably dangerous terrain generation. Thus, the players are allowed to transfer realms. This allows for their character and its inventory to move to a new random world. To discourage the frequent hopping of realm to realm, the player can only take with them the items equipped on their character and within their inventory, thus leaving behind any buildings and/or stored items. In order to provide more varied gameplay, Eternal Sins expands on the traditional game loop by adding subloops to the gather and build phases. When gathering items, a player has the choice to simply purchase an item. This may be desirable if the item requires significant labor, or if it's located a significant distance from the player's base. If the player does not have sufficient currency to afford the item, they can choose to go out and invest that time and labor, or to collect various resources of a different nature and sell those to the auction house. This allows the player to choose the parts of the game that they find most favorable. Finally, upon completing the build phase, the player can review their inventory and sell or store any unnecessary items to prepare for the gather phase. This will assist in inventory size, travel speed, and can provide emergency money. This loop is sustainable for a significant portion of the game, due to its procedural nature. Players will be faced with new challenges as they venture further and encounter new content. However, players also need a target and a state to strive for. That is the endgame. Within these procedural worlds, the player may encounter elite bosses. These creatures are removed from the main play space by being situated within temples. These temples are filled with traps and creatures that require an investment of time and power from the player. Should the player complete the temple and defeat the elite boss, they will acquire extremely rare items that they may sell or use to craft high-level items. To be able to defeat these enemies, players must be significantly leveled, and temples will likely require specific mechanics to be unlocked, gliding or grappling, for example. The generation of terrain and biome data in Eternal Sins will be calculated using multi-octave Perlin noise, with additional modifications made for water erosion and channels to be formed after the initial generation process is concluded. This is the most effective path to natural terrain that I've found thus far. It has an added advantage of being easily storable as a Vector 3 array for simple loading. This system might be observed in popular games such as Minecraft by Mojang and No Man's Sky by Hello Games. Resources such as trees and rocks will be spawned using biome and tile data. Thus, more weeds will spawn in a swamp and more trees will spawn in a forest. Using various simplification methods, a node map might be generated on terrain to allow for A-star movement pathing for AI and enemies. This would also allow for the possible implementation of auto-travel for the player, should it choose to be appropriate. Temple generation is vastly different to terrain generation. Temple variation is important for an extensive endgame, and it is important that a temple always be succeedable. In order to facilitate this, I'm going to use a wave function collapse algorithm with pre-made tile sets. This allows for almost infinite possible variations, however with simple modifications you have start, end, and path points. The systems of storage within Eternal Sins are varied. The first encountered and the most utilized is the player's inventory. This inventory is persistent between sessions and the default repository for all items that are harvested or gifted to the player. To encourage players to construct permanent storage facilities and to introduce obstacles into the gather phase of gameplay, the inventory is limited. Due to a player's need to carry essential items such as food and tools, this introduces a sorting and prioritization mechanic as well. This system of player inventory is styled after common MMO inventories such as Ion and World of Warcraft, with influence from a popular survival game such as Ark. Chests and containers come in two flavors. These may be crafted persistent storage or lootable crates. Crafted persistent storage is fully persistent and unlimited. This allows for players to set up cache locations at their base and at strategic locations throughout the wild. Possible future work includes the integration of a sorting mechanic to allow players to sort by type, weight, or rarity. Lootable storage might be found at enemy camps or when an enemy is killed. Once items are removed from it, the storage disappears and the container only lasts about 10 minutes regardless. Another form of temporary storage is the crafting area. In order to obtain most items, the player will use crafting stations such as an anvil or woodworking table. The player will pass the items that serve as components into the table, and once complete, the crafted item will also be stored there. Items stored within a crafting table are automatically transferred to the player at the end of its use. Should the player not be able to receive these items, such as if they use 2 components to create 3 items, the item will remain in the crafting table, however only until the player's inventory can accept it. Crafting as a mechanic is present in many games, and the system takes heavy influence from Minecraft and World of Warcraft crafting systems. In order to encourage direct multiplayer cooperation, I am also implementing a shared inventory. This is a single menu-based inventory that is shared by 2 players. It can be used for trade or simply for temporary storage while a play session persists. Any items remaining in this inventory will be transferred to the host player at the session end. Finally, we have the NPC inventory. This provides an avenue for the player to sell items that is not networked. Due to the nature of in-game trading, the price of items on this store will form the basis of price on the auction house. There is no point placing wood on the auction house to sell for 1 gold when it sells for 2 gold at the store. There's no point buying wood for 5 gold on the auction house when it's priced at 3 at the store. Goods present in a shop NPC's inventory will refresh every 60 minutes, including items sold to the NPC by the player. NPC inventories will be typed, and the type of item will be decided by chance and location. NPC shops forming a basis for auction house economies is observable in many MMORPGs, including those mentioned earlier, as well as in games such as Terra and Guild Wars 2. The goal of this game is to create a functional real-world or virtual economy. However, in order to stimulate trade as a whole, players who aren't willing to risk or participate in real money trade will trade in the in-game economy. This is formed up of parts including the auction house, the direct send and mail system, and the aforementioned PC vendors. These components allow for player choice in how they distribute and acquire goods and don't force the player into any one playstyle. As mentioned, the goal of this venture is to create a thriving real-world or virtual economy. For the purpose of simplicity, the game will be confined to Australia to begin with, so I only have one set of currency exchange and tax laws to reckon with. The trade systems of the virtual economy will center around the auction house feature, however access to this will be spread throughout the implementation of the game's media. The auction house itself will contain a real-world mode, and the player must switch consciously in order to begin trading. At this point, if they have not already registered them, the player must confirm bank details for money to be sourced from and deposited to. In order to sustain the virtual economy online systems and to create a profit, the auction house will automatically deduct 0.5% from any listing entered to the auction house. If after the 10-day period the item is not sold, the item will be returned to the player, but not the deduction. Purchases and listings can only be created from within the game, through the auction house system. However, management of existing bids and listings is accessible through multiple access points. This includes the game's public website and its launcher. The Eternal Sins website will also contain forums for the player's discussion of an item's worth and informal deals. While informal agreements are not enforced by the company, players will have a reputation system within the forums, with players being allowed to assign a positive value to another player upon completion of a deal. The game launcher functions with the same access to existing listings and bids as the website, but lacks the ability to view the forums. This functionality is simply to assist the player in deciding whether they actually wish to enter the game, such as whether their item has sold. The final form of real money transactions comes from the game store. This is not an inter-player transfer, rather a direct transfer between the player and the company. The game store includes microtransactions for items such as DLC and event items. None of these items are locked to the player, and upon purchase they may be sold by the player to the auction house, and perhaps unwisely to the NPC store. In order to facilitate a fair gaming experience, items that directly influence a player's ability to compete or speed through a game will not be sold at the game store, such as experience, high-level gear, or buffs. The store will instead be largely comprised of aesthetic items for allowing for further player customization of equipment and avatar appearance, even allowing for the crafting of custom skin furniture which may be sold on the auction house. As far as I know, this level of trading integration is not currently present within existing multiplayer trading systems, and there may be a very good reason for this. However, some games such as EVE Online allow the player to access their trade and player data through a companion app, placing direct control back in the developer's hands. In order for new players to be able to grow and progress, there will need to be trade between them and the more experienced players. In order to facilitate this, there will be a series of core items that are usable by every level. For example, simple wood planks. Wood as an item is versatile and used in many crafting recipes. As the recipe and the player level increases, the amount of wood required will also increase, and while higher level players are more able to gather wood than new players, they likely don't want to. It's so much easier to just go to the auction house and source their wood from there at a relatively low price. This presents an opportunity for new players to farm wood and place it on the store, gaining themselves currency which they can use to speed the progression at an early game experience. Thank you for listening to my presentation. Any feedback is of course welcome, and if you can please post it to the discussion forum, I'll go over it and see what I can make of it.